This is item 35 in the posted agenda, and we will go to Mr. Rogers for the presentation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much. Just wanted to triple check that you're able to see the slides in front of you.
We can see the slides and we can also hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm joined today by my colleagues in CPHD, both Mr. Richard Tucker and Miss Jennifer Smith, and we are, quite frankly, we're really excited to be here with you before you today, presenting our recommendations for a zoning ordinance amendment, which would enable the board to permit increases in building height for affordable housing projects located in 3 of our county's multifamily residential zoning districts. And this is joint work that our planning division has been working on in coordination with CPHD's housing division underneath the broader Housing Arlington initiative. And of course, the item before you that's today is a resolution that, if adopted, it would authorize the manager to advertise public hearings for yourselves in the Planning Commission next month to consider amending the ordinance in this manner. And so I have a number of slides that I'll advance through with you and members of the public who are watching this morning. I do want to share an overview of some of our the basics of our multifamily zoning, the intersection of changes to housing affordability zoning standards over the years, some of the regional development trends that we've been studying and sponging up that have been at the center of staff's analysis. Of course, we'll be presenting the staff recommendations so that you and your colleagues are fully understanding what's in the staff report, and as well as an overview of some of the public engagement and outreach on the feedback that we've received. So diving right in, Mr. Chair, for those of you who of course have read our research compendiums for the missing middle housing study, or if you're just a student of Arlington's planning and zoning, you know that the county has had dedicated zoning standards for different levels of multifamily development dating back to 1942, actually. And these zoning standards govern a host of dimensional characteristics for our multifamily development, things like minimum lot size, lot width, maximum height, maximum dwelling units per acre, among others. And we've done some extensive research on some of the basic changes to these over the years. And we've found that those dimensional standards have been consistent and unchanged since 1978. Taking a look at the county's stock of garden-style apartments, those 2 to 4, oftentimes brick buildings. We know that generally those were constructed during the era of the approximately the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s. The vast majority of those are zoned one of those 3 multifamily dwelling districts that are within the scope of this study. Those are RA 1426, RA 818, and RA 615. You're going to hear me saying those numbers several times throughout the presentation today. And while those base standards have remained consistent, the previous boards have amended other sections of the zoning ordinance over the years to facilitate the creation of more affordable housing here in Arlington. And this goes all the way back to 1972 with the original bonus height and density standards that were added to the zoning ordinance then. Among other provisions, the board adopted standards that would enable an additional 6 stories in height and an additional 10% residential density bonus for what we were referring to at the time as moderate income housing units. And these bonus provisions were enabled for development applicants who submitted what was at the time a fairly new tool in Arlington. That's our site plan application process that we've relied on so diligently over the years. Moving ahead to 1992, the board at the time made further amendments to the zoning ordinance, but the focus this time was solely on those 3 RA districts at the heart of today's study. Taking a look at the staff reports at the time, we've learned that, the sentiment being most of the county's apartments in those districts we know that they were developed under by right provisions during that 1930s to 1960s era. And at the time, the county felt a need to create incentives to enable revitalization and reinvestment in our garden apartments using the site plan process. And the thinking at the time was that there was a need to preserve existing apartments from, quite frankly, meeting the wrecking ball, becoming higher cost rentals, condos, or even townhouses. Property owners could voluntarily request designation and as a voluntary coordinated housing preservation and development district, and as a coordinated multiple family conservation and development district. Thank you for bearing with me, Mr. Chair. And these designations, once approved, would unlock special site plan provisions for increased height, increased density, more flexible site layouts in return for the property owner, the applicant, setting aside some percentage of those as a lower moderate income housing. It was determined on a case-by-case basis. At the time, the conventional wisdom was that the county would be seeking 20% of the units to be set aside as affordable for a term of approximately 20 years. And these increases in height enabled by the 1992 amendment, they would range anywhere from an additional 10 feet on up to an additional 25. So approximately 1 to 2 stories, depending on the zoning district. These 1992 provisions were updated and streamlined in 2001. That procedural requirement for the district designation that was removed, it was just a request that an applicant could make as part of the site plan process. The board added several submission requirements to ensure that the applicant was comprehensively demonstrating to staff, the board, the community that their approach to providing or perhaps preserving affordable housing. And then as almost a corollary, almost a sidebar to this streamlining, the board updated the site plan provisions, which had been already increased from that 1972, the 10% bonus that went to 15% in the early 1980s. And in 2001, that site plan density bonus went to 25%. Of course, in 2017, the board established the Housing Conservation District as a designation in our GLUP, as well as in the zoning ordinance. The explicit goal of that work was to make sure that we were doing what we could to retain our existing market rate affordable housing, or what we call MARCs colloquially. There was a need that we've documented at the time, which is still in place, of course, to preserve as much as possible our affordable rent rates, preventing the loss of MARCs due to by right townhouse redevelopment. And staff spoke at the time that whereas that phase 1 work was adopted by the board, there was going to be follow-on work in a phase 2 of the project. And you're going to be hearing me mention that as we broaden the scope of that work. But the goals of the phase 2 work was to ensure that we were bringing back to the board financial modeling, economic analysis that would inform some new optional setback and height standards within housing conservation district areas that would allow for some incremental increases in development intensity, predictable, economically feasible, in exchange for commitments of preservation or the creation of housing affordability. And then the final text amendment that I'll mention to you all was the 2019 bonus density amendment to the ordinances. The board adopted at the time several changes that restructured and reorganized those bonus density standards, had their origins back in that 1972 action. Among other changes, the affordable housing bonus provisions were actually reconfigured to replace that 6-story in height bonus and the 25% density bonus, which we generally term as uncapped density, height and density. And what I mean by that is rather than looking to these metrics in the zoning ordinance, a development applicant is now looking at the adopted area and sector plan to see what those maximum thresholds of development can be achieved, and the applicant needs to demonstrate to staff, members of the community, the Planning Commission, and you that the development is meeting those objectives of those area and sector plans. If it's within a phased development site plan, a PDSP, similar board approved policy. Now, with that change, the board's action did include several editorial changes, including a clarification that the site plan development in RA districts, subject to the affordability regulations that I previously mentioned in 1992 and 2001, that those maximum heights listed there, either 60 or 70 feet, those were the absolute maximum, that the board's modification authority was not applicable, no matter what the area or sector plan said, for those 3 RA districts in question. And it's one of the hearts of the matter of the amendment before you today. And this was something that was on our radar at the time, and this distinction was drawn because whereas we have the rich planning history and the understanding and the vision within our sector and area plans, we conversely, there is an extent of the county, and you'll see in the map in this presentation in your staff report, there's broad extents in the county that are quote unquote unplanned, that are zoned one of these 3 RA districts that don't have that same definition of what the development vision and potential are. And so we wanted to make sure that further study was made of the RA zoned property in the county. We've committed to doing that as part of the Housing Conservation District Phase 2 work, and to further evaluate the prospect of similar measures that were talked about with that bonus density amendment for implementation. So a lot of history there right now. Want to bring us more to today, Mr. Chair, and despite all of what I've just described, the region and the county continues to experience severe shortages of available housing affordable to residents who are not in high income earning affluent households. And the culprits are familiar trends that you've been briefed on by staff, as well as county residents, housing advocates as well. We've documented that loss of the market rate affordable apartments as part of the HCD work in 2017. For you and members of the public, as a reminder, in 2000, the county had just a little over 17,000 marks affordable to households that made no more than 60% of the area median income. Fast forward to 2016, that number was reduced to just under 3,000, and approximately 84% decrease. And the reasons are in some instances are redevelopment. In most cases, it was just simply rising rents, making those apartments unaffordable for folks making 60 or 80% of the AMI. And then occasionally it would be through partnerships where those marks were being converted to our committed affordable unit program, the CAFs. The county has been very fortunate over the past several decades to have several nonprofit affordable housing developers who stepped in, often with financial support from the county, to purchase, renovate, and maintain those affordable rents for these marks properties. We've been successful with this program since the late 1970s. The county and its housing partners have preserved the affordability of approximately 4,500 marks, usually through loans to acquire the marks properties and stabilize them. But the degree and the order of magnitude is one that just that tool alone is not a financially feasible solution to combat these chronic affordability issues that we're seeing. And those issues are underpinned by the success, the region's economic success, the increased job opportunities that have come to the region, the population growth over the past 2 decades. It's made housing production a priority, not just for our jurisdiction, but for every single local government in the DC metro area. We have not been resting on our laurels and our heels in this regard. We've been actively working to combat these things through Housing Arlington. And we've had some success, and we're continuing to work toward that. Of course, you know about our work with the missing middle housing study, looking for new housing types to add to our housing stock. You'll recall the elder care work that the board adopted in late 2019 so that we modernized our standards for our seniors pertaining to assisted living, independent living. And then we have what we're billing as the multifamily reinvestment study, and I'll speak on that later. That's the expanded scope of our HCD work. And so all of these trends and this history, it results in a series of findings that has really brought us before you today to recommend some near-term action that would be applicable immediately in the coming months. And so within our RA areas, we do have individual areas and sites that are oftentimes located in transitional areas between our transit station metro rail areas where we're concentrating the vast majority of our development, transitioning between those areas and our low density residential neighborhoods that would be appropriate for some level of increased building height to add to our housing stock. That being said, because of that transitional nature, we do feel the need for some appropriate land use safeguards to ensure that there can be some effective transitions made from a design and site layout perspective between the development site and the surrounding neighborhoods. We do have, in addition, we do have some historical precedent that I've gone over with you today. We have had bonus provisions in the past that have allowed for increases in building height in exchange for housing affordability. Up until recently, that exchange could result in an up to 6-story increase. And while those bonus provisions for uncapped height are currently not available in the RA districts, the uncapped density provision can be approved by the board in the RA districts through the site plan process. And on top of that, we're aware that enabling increased height for particularly our affordable housing developers would allow the county to would ensure rather that the county does not avoid missed opportunities for advancing new affordable housing projects, particularly during the next year's funding and tax credit cycles as we continue to advance the work on the multifamily reinvestment study. We know, of course, we've been speaking to members of the development community. They have shared with us some disruptions in certain segments of the housing market because of the pandemic. That being said, we are looking far into the future, and we're continuing to keep our eyes on the future. We are not foreseeing that the DC area will lose its economic clout as a center for a robust local economy. We are projecting that the need for housing production supply, growth, and demand, that those trends will continue on. I did mention earlier some of that adjustment in the scope. Previously, the HCD work was really focused on targeted areas in the county where there was this alignment between the general land use plan designations and concentrations of marks that in combination with one another were creating essentially low-hanging fruit opportunities for an overall net reduction in housing through townhouse redevelopment. And since those economic influences that I mentioned about on Arlington's housing market and the demand, those are manifesting not just in those targeted areas, but in every single neighborhood in Arlington. We wanted to take a broader look at this and expand the scope so that we were being expansive to look at all of our multifamily zoned areas to try to modernize those standards. Again, that I mentioned have been consistent and unchanged since 1978. So we are still carrying forward with our multifamily reinvestment study, the housing conservation district goals and objectives, addressing challenges from zoning nonconformities, for example, modernizing the development standards, making sure that we're providing affordable housing still for residents at either the 60% or 88% AMI tiers. Of course, we want to be increasing the supply of multifamily housing with the multifamily reinvestment study, but we want to make sure that we're also effectively integrating new development within and among the surrounding built environment in existing neighborhoods. And you heard, some in the last item about the need to be mindful of the county's cultural resources and our historic resources inventory. A key piece of the HCD work that we are still have incorporated and including in full force with the multifamily reinvestment study. And so bringing all that to today's resolution before you, we are recommending a near-term and what we really frankly see as an interim action to amend the zoning ordinance that would enable the county board to modify the maximum building height standards for the 3 RA districts within the study scope. You see those districts here on the screen, the 1426, 818, and 615. Now, this modification of height would come as part of your site plan process. You're accustomed to reviewing and hearing staff's recommendations on a host of different modifications that the zoning ordinance enables. This would be yet another one that an applicant would request and would need to justify to you all. There are a couple key prerequisites and findings that the board would need to agree with, essentially, in order to grant that modification. The first is that only development sites or development projects where 100% of the proposed units would be set aside as low and moderate income housing, that those are going to be the projects that would be eligible for this increase in building height. We do want to be mindful of sort of the diversity of different products and projects and development opportunities that are out there. And so in the instance where a creative application came your way where less than 100% of the units would be affordable, and the developer was demonstrating that other goals and objectives of the Affordable Housing Master Plan were being met, we do want to give the board some flexibility to consider increasing building height in those instances as well. But the key goal and the key objective is for this to be is for the applicant to only be making this request when a significant commitment to affordable housing is being made. And of course, I mentioned that need for effective transitions. We've added some finding language that further challenges the development applicant to be mindful of those transitions to the surrounding built environment. And we don't want to presuppose what those tools are to be used, but we know that the tools are plentiful. And so we anticipate that oftentimes things like landscaping buffers, setbacks, step backs, architectural facade treatments, other similar measures, we're really going to be looking to development applicants to be utilizing those tools and working with the community as part of the conventional SPRC process, working with staff, working with the civic associations on that process. I do want to make this is a very important distinction, Mr. Chair. We do see this as an interim measure that it would enable the board to be responsive immediately, and by immediately within the next calendar year, to affordable housing development projects that are outside of our planning areas, that don't have that sector plan or area guidance. We have within our scope for the multifamily reinvestment study, we have space that we're going to be reevaluating these provisions with the great likelihood that there will be further edits, possible removal and replacement with alternative language as part of the ultimate recommendations for the multifamily reinvestment study. So we did, and this was part of your staff report. Visuals are important. We got very helpful feedback from the Housing Commission and the Planning Commission Zoning Committee back in January, really needing to understand, well, where are we talking about? Where are these RA districts? And so the map you're seeing on your viewer here, this is also on our website. This is publicly available. And in the board report, it shows the 3 R districts in those earth tone colors. And if we need to, Mr. Chair, we can go back to the slide during the questions if the discussion warrants it. As far as engagement, this was a short-term review study on our work plan. And so we have had a summary of the study's scope and my contact information on the zoning studies website for a couple months now. The study's schedule has been posted there, a comment inbox for members of the public to use. And we scaled our short-term strategy to our engagement strategy that was scaled to conduct some targeted outreach to key audiences, particularly within the affordable housing development community, within a time frame that was given the limited scope of the study. So we've sort of we've created the engagement strategy to go with the scope of the study. And you've seen some of that feedback, and I believe you've seen some of that feedback in writing and perhaps in public testimony today. We did outline this. We were very pleased to get a lot of feedback on this work from a bunch of different corners of the community. We've documented that ad nauseum in the staff report. Overall, I do want to highlight a couple areas where some additional discussion is warranted. By and large, we received feedback where staff and the community and the board, we were challenged to make sure we were not further degrading the county's remaining supply of marks with this work. We don't think it is. We received some feedback on providing increased clarity in those findings, and that's good feedback. We do think the SPRC process and just the need to be flexible on a site-by-site, case-by-case basis. We're comfortable, even though it's vague and we'd love to give some more clarity. We think the level of clarity that's in the language now is suitable for the needs at hand. And we also received some feedback. Well, have you considered other zoning districts? Have you considered such provisions for market rate development projects as well? And we're keeping it to the multifamily. It's the multifamily reinvestment studies. We're keeping it to the multifamily districts, but those broader recommendations that would be eligible and would not have the 100% requirement, we are examining that. We do plan to bring that to you in the first quarter of next year. We have been working closely with the board office over the past couple of days. We are aware of several emails that you and your colleagues received about the prospect of this tool being utilized in a Boston area site. My understanding is that the site in question has an approved site plan already on it that was amended by the board last year. And I just wanted to point out to the board and members of the public, there may have been some communication, something lost in translation there. Those sites that you were receiving all that email traffic on, those are zoned RC. So the interim zoning ordinance that's in front of you today, it would not be applicable. A development applicant, even if they wanted to, would not be eligible for requesting increased height through these provisions at that site. So we've also received, and I'll be closing shortly, Mr. Chair, but I did want to give some time to some of the good feedback that we've received. We're continuing to get engagement from the Lee Highway Corridor, the Plan Lee Highway co-chairs, who of course wrote you last week. And I just wanted to reassure you and members of the public that we are in close coordination with Ms. Alfonso Ahmed, who's our Plan Lee Highway project manager. And and I'll share a schedule slide here in a moment, but she is continuing to work with the community for the remainder of the year on a land use scenario analysis that will be followed by a preliminary concept plan, refining that concept further in coordination with the Lee Highway community stakeholders. And the goal is bringing those recommendations to you in the first quarter of next year. And I just wanted to categorically emphasize, and we did this on Thursday morning when myself and Mr. Tucker were pleased, and it was good for us to attend the Lee Highway Alliance's board meeting. Just wanted to reemphasize that we on staff are aligned with the community members in ensuring that the vision and the goals and objectives that are adopted with the Plan Lee Highway process, that is the prevailing vision that all development conforms to. And so we are sensitive and sympathetic to some of the concerns that have been raised. Well, what if this conflicts, or what if this is out of line, or what if there is a project that we don't know about in the interim that takes advantage of these and upsets that vision? We don't see that as likely. I do share those concerns, but we don't see that likely based on the conversations and the pre-application concepts that we've been speaking with some of our nonprofit, the typical nonprofit partners who have developed here in Arlington. And much like I mentioned previously that we would be reconciling the MRS work back with this amendment, we will be doing the exact same reconciliation process with Plan Lee Highway. So the two studies, the schedules of Plan Lee Highway and the MRS aligned very closely. So we don't have one going back in front of the other. We'll be tracking those alongside each other, coordinating and reconciling again, so that the vision for Plan Lee Highway is the prevailing vision. That's what the development community will need to meet as part of that community-led planning process. And so we are here before you today with this request to advertise resolution. If it's adopted, we'll be in front of the Planning Commission early next month. We will be returning the second time to the Housing Commission for an action item. And then, of course, your public hearing would be at your regularly scheduled month and at your meeting next month. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll close. Our recommendation is very simple, that the board authorize the manager to advertise for public hearings next month for you and the Planning Commission on this affordable housing building height modification provision. And myself and my colleagues are be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, for the presentation and focus on some pieces of the history of our zoning ordinance. First, I'll say again, this is a request to advertise. We would be, if we approve, we would be hearing this again next month after our commissions have had a chance to weigh in. I believe we have, as a result, the commissions are not here today because it's a request to advertise. But I believe we do have some public speakers. As we move towards public speakers, certainly I know we've received some concerns. But let's go ahead and hear from our public speakers, and then we'll have a discussion with the board. Madam Clerk.
Our first speaker is Charles Sims, followed by Ann Bodine.
Mr. Sims.
Hello. Yes, my name is Charles Sims, and I'm a senior project manager with the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, and I'm also an Arlington resident. I'm the project manager for the Marbella redevelopment, which this proposal would greatly benefit and aid to the creation of affordable housing. Without it, it would severely hinder the ability to do that project. This proposal would also further the county's, would increase the amount of affordable housing and also further the county's goals toward its master plan. I want to thank the staff for their work and support of this effort, and I want to thank the board for I appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of this measure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sims. Appreciate your note and also your letter, I believe, on this subject as well. Next, we'll hear from our next speaker, Madam Clerk.
Our next and final speaker is Ann Bodine.
Ms. Bodine.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Mr. Manager, and staff, thank you for your time today and for all the work you've done in your presentation. I'm Ann Bodine, and I represent Arlingtonians for Our Sustainable Future. ASF would like to request the board reject the county manager's recommendation to amend Articles 12 and 15 of the zoning ordinance pending further study. ASF strongly favors affordable housing, and we will continue to submit ideas short of upzoning the county could take in pursuit of those goals. We have some questions the board should address before approving new density. In terms of fiscal impact, how will the county pay for and provide sites for schools, parks, roads, public safety, and health facilities for the many new residents you would approve today? We've asked these same questions about Missing Middle Project. The board tells us we are anti-growth. We are not. We are realists. We believe in having all one's ducks in a row before adopting new policies, especially ones likely to displace existing residents, add budget pressures, and wreak environmental damage. The board is free to refute our fiscal projections by releasing its own long-term fiscal outlooks, and we ask that you do so urgently. In terms of environmental impact, we see almost monthly new site plan redevelopments that produce piles of rubble in Roslyn or Crystal City and replaced by expansive, taller high-rises. This takes an environmental toll. Bill Gates has just called on progressive thinkers to look beyond concrete and steel for future construction needs. Your density proposal will likely lead to more concrete high-rises and may run counter to meeting these climate challenges. As we know, a majority of high-rise projects produce blocky structures where green space is an afterthought and trees are removed to make room for concrete and steel. As we note with the fiscal impacts of growth Arlington style, the constant density drive is doing more harm than good in other areas as well, namely displacement. We applaud the social benefit of 100% affordable units, The cutout for less than 100% is very unclear, however, and dilutes the significance. The policy is also not clear to what extent builders can provide moderate units versus low or low moderate income, nor does it encourage deep affordability. If we are just masking subsidies for units mostly at 80% of median area income, ASF opposes that game plan. We ask more study be given to the extent to which owners of naturally occurring affordable housing will be incentivized to remove those homes, promoting future gentrification. We understand some of the affected neighborhoods did not feel they were sufficiently involved in the process, which would bring new 12-story buildings to their area. You have tried to assure us that any potential overreach by builders will be addressed in site plan reviews, but we have seen no restraint in this area in the past. In sum, the reasons for delay are many, and we ask that you expand your impact analyses to focus on these questions we raised before approving new density. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bodine. So we have those are all the speakers on this request to advertise today. We'll open the floor for questions. I will start with one. Mr. Rogers, you mentioned that there was some correspondence regarding whether this would apply in specific areas. You mentioned Ballston, is that right? Can you say anything more about that concern?
Yes, I can. I'll do my best. And Ms. Smith and Mr. Tucker may have some more context on the particular site and the particular development proposal at hand. But again, the scope of this study is focused on 3 zoning districts. And if you turn to, and I'm happy to share this on this screen, but on page 15 of the staff report in attachment 1 with the draft language, it's clear that the provisions would be limited to just the 3 multi-family districts that we focused on in our presentation. So again, I understand and appreciate the concerns that were raised by the several residents who have emailed us. The particular areas and the particular development sites in question are zoned. They are zoned our RC district. That was the district that was adopted in the late 1970s to in advance of the Ballston area sector plan to help implement that plan. So the item before you today would not be applicable in that setting.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Helpful, and certainly I could imagine there would be follow-up. So on that question. So I think next to Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rogers, do you have any thoughts about how you would implement the ability for findings to allow for alternatives other than a 100% committed project? I'm really kind of interested in understanding the sequencing here. Clearly, staff is looking for a basis to accept proposals, and 100% affordability is clear, but absent some other pre-guidance on findings, what would be the basis by which staff would accept a proposal that didn't do 100% affordability under this plan?
This is a good question, Mr. Dorsey, and I do appreciate you asking it. And it was a common theme that came up with both the Housing Commission and the Zoning Committee's initial feedback on our work. And I can appreciate the need for some more definition and some guardrails to the baselines in that regard. And we, quite frankly, we were hesitant and apprehensive to be limiting or very structured in that, other than in the event that an applicant is looking to you for some sort of relief from that 100% requirement. They need to be looking at some of the different goals and objectives within the affordable housing master plan. And I want to be very careful on not presupposing or really elevating one goal or another, but there may be an example of a mixed income project, for example, that when we look at the totality of it, we see that this is advancing different types of objectives in the Affordable Housing Master Plan. I believe one of our speakers mentioned the prospect of deeper affordability. Could a mixed income development provide deeper commitments of affordability below that 60% AMI for our neediest of residents? Those are potential amongst with needing to look at a lot of other different factors. Those would be the potential type of unique situations where I think the board would be warranted with some increased flexibility on a case-by-case basis. I can sympathize with the sort of the openness of that language, but those are some of our initial thoughts where we felt that maximum flexibility was most warranted.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I'll just say I agree. Maybe over the next month, I'd be interested in working with you colleagues to figure out if maybe there is a document of some sort that could memorialize some of that thinking. I would hate to get to a point where you have developers thinking about a proposal that will meet with the board's favor. You go through a process, spend a lot of money and time, only to have us or the board as the ultimate arbiters of whether or not those findings work. To determine whether it should move forward. Maybe we should provide some guidance at the outset. So we should think about that over the coming month.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Karantonis.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I was thinking in similar terms with Mr. Dorsey. I was thinking about something else, about the committed affordable units duration, for example, which was not included in the list of feedback that was in the. So it makes a very big difference if the height is affordable. For the height, the density is forever, right? If it's 30 years or 60 years or otherwise. That was for me important. There was also another, and Mr. Rogers. Feel free to comment on that, but I am satisfied by the commitment of Mr. Dorsey, and I believe all our colleagues to discuss that a little bit more during this month that we will have between advertisement and adoption.
Thank you.
The other thing that I wanted to ask is we receive. I mean, I understand about the Lee Highway planning process where that takes that is superior, so to say, in that. Than the measure that we're contemplating today. But there were other discussions as well. The fact is that if we look at the map, these RA districts are mostly distributed in South Arlington, most of them. And we had one neighborhood, Green Valley, who was also concerned about the potential of, what they consider character infringing against neighborhood character, height in a potential project. How do you evaluate that risk?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mr. Karantonis. I think my initial feedback and counsel, and this is something that we didn't get into in great detail in the presentation. I wanted to comment a bit on scale, and I'm going to make an initial attempt. Mr. Tucker may be able to further clarify this for you, but we are anticipating we typically see anywhere from 1 to 2 of these types of affordable housing projects that I'm describing to you in a calendar year, in any one low-income housing tax credit cycle. Sometimes it's here in Arlington, sometimes it's in another one of our Northern Virginia jurisdictions. There's of course, rigorous competition to win those. And so in the event that we in Arlington, who would greatly benefit for more affordable housing, in the event that our nonprofit partners are successful in pulling together the complex financial resources and can dot those I's and cross those T's, we are anticipating no more than 1, possibly 2 development applicants coming through the process for a 100% affordable project in any given calendar year, and that's countywide. That might be in an RA area, that might be in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, that might be in and around Crystal City somewhere. So as far as frequency, scale, and likelihood, we see we see such provisions only needing to be utilized potentially 1 to 2 times a year. And that's important to frame the feedback that you and your colleagues received and we received from Green Valley and other neighborhoods which have similar circumstances and which, quite frankly, have commented to county staff where they do not want to bear a disproportionate amount of the county's burden for providing affordable housing to the entirety of our jurisdiction. We're sympathetic to that. We have what's the word I'm trying to think of? We have structured our NOFA process for awarding AHIF money to be scoring and to be thinking about broader geographic distribution, not just in South Arlington, for our affordable housing partners, and that need to more greatly distribute more equitably affordable housing throughout all of our neighbors. That's throughout our neighborhoods rather. That's a central theme and objective in our existing affordable housing master plan. So I also want to characterize that some of and we had after receiving some initial feedback from Green Valley, Mr. Tucker and I were very pleased to get some time to have a more frank one-on-one conversation with some of the community leaders, which was very helpful to understand how some of the operational challenges, shall I say, with some of the local projects there have created some real anxiety. Well, will the next affordable housing project have the same impacts on our neighborhood? And while those are valid concerns, they are somewhat mutually exclusive from the prospect of enabling increased height for an individual project on an individual site. So I hope that covers some of the key points and provides some more context to the board.
Yes, and together with your narrative about how interim this measure is in expectation of the completion of the MRS, the multi-family reinvestment study.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're muted.
This is my second today, so I'll try and move us forward. So thank you, Mr. Carantonis and Mr. Rogers for the answer. We'll go to Ms. Garvey and then Ms. Crystal.
Yeah, thank you, and I'll be brief. I'm really delighted to see us. You know, we passed that. The HCD was pretty quick. There was a lot that had to happen. And I'm delighted to see us continuing to move forward and having this, kind of get to a point where we can, it's an interim step, but it's a solid one that we can continue to move forward on it. I think I really liked Mr. Dorsey's suggestion, Mr. Rogers, which is, I don't know quite how to describe it. Obviously, I should go back to Mr. Dorsey, but it feels like we're sort of heading towards maybe sort of a companion piece or a working paper or something that kind of puts together the thinking behind this, not something the board's going to adopt, but that when we get to the advertisement, there's something that's maybe a little more accessible for our residents, because obviously there were some folks very concerned about this and upset that it was going to apply to them, but it actually,
yes,
as I understand from you, doesn't. And then you've got developers wondering, well, does this mean this and this? And obviously, as Mr. Dorsey said, you don't want them moving forward with some assumptions, and then it gets to us, and suddenly, well, no, that's not what we want to do. So I don't know how to describe that or what it might be. Do you think is that pushing it too much? I assume it's probably pulling together existing thought and it wouldn't be too long. Is that something you might be able to sort of pull together, I guess, as a presentation, perhaps even for next month when we adopt, if we go ahead to advertise today?
At a minimum, Ms. Garvey, what we'll be doing is discussing it internally. I'm hearing loud and clear from the board members that and I appreciate sort of your further clarification description on, could a companion piece or some sort of written context, just some sort of additional clarity. I'm hearing that the board would really like us to study that and see what we can do. And so let us take that feedback, and if for some reason we're unable to do that, we're going to come back to you next month with a good reason why.
Oh, that's absolutely fun. Really appreciate that. I always like this thing we're adopting. It gives flexibility to the board. The board gets to decide. I always like that. And I think this is just part of our whole movement on trying to crack the nut of housing affordability and making it so different types of people can afford to comfortably live here, and we keep the community we want. There's so much misunderstanding out there. There's a lot of concern and fear, which we're all picking up in different contexts. So I feel like this is just part of that whole conversation. Missing middle is another part of it, but it's really what we're all about these days, and communication is the key, and really tough. And I doubt we'll ever get it right exactly, but at least we keep kind of refining it and working on it. So appreciate your work on it, and I will be pleased to support the motion. Thank you. Do we have a motion? I think we do.
I wanted to make a motion, but after we.
When we do, I'll be pleased to support it.
Got it. Thank you, Ms. Garvey.
Yeah.
So Ms. Crystal's next. We do need to eventually have a motion on the table. So we'll start with Ms. Crystal, and then we'll go to a motion.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm glad to come in on the tail end of some good questions. Mr. Rogers, forgive me if you covered this already, but I wanted to probe a little more on the future relationship of this amendment, if adopted, and the MRS amendments to the zoning ordinance, policy guidance, et cetera. So you helpfully shared with us that the zoning ordinance amendments, formerly known as housing conservation districts, which is what I'm going to call them with the Prince symbol in my mind.
That's right.
Are now on track for potential adoption in the first quarter of 2022, which is about this time next year, right? So if you could fast forward in time, right, to a potential adoption of those amendments, what do you anticipate the final relationship of the amendment that we're advertising today and the amendments of facilitated by the MRS study would be? Do you imagine that ultimately anything we adopt with the MRS study would end up sort of superseding and cleaning up and kind of being the dominant frame for heights and density in other areas in these unplanned districts? Or do you envision a future in which sort of MRS gives some guidance and the amendment that is under consideration now still holds? Does that question make sense?
It does, and I fear so. Like the short answer is yes, but I don't. I want to be more fulsome in my response and sort of predicting what the future is going to look like. I think the best way for me to respond, Ms. Crystal, is that we know that we have some key findings in our existing conditions in the community. We have some areas which are of our RA zoning, which are small, 2-story on very small site, maybe 8 to 10 units from that kind of 1940s and 50s development era that sort of no one builds it that way anymore. And so that's at one end of the multifamily spectrum, all the way up to 10-story towers, 14-story towers in a large site in a sea of parking. And so I can see a scenario that as we are looking to re-examine the prospect of a development applicant who wants to do an affordable project, if they want to request an additional 60 feet of height, well, how does that match up with the narrative and the recommendations for that kind of low, medium, and high range of our, we have a variety of different multifamily settings. And, right now we feel the board needs flexibility in the near term, in the interim, to be proactive. Oftentimes we're coming to you from a reactive stance. We're being proactive with you today. But sort of aligning and attenuating those recommendations to the different scale and to the different surrounding contexts, that's the type of finer grain work we want to be doing and we want to bring to you, and it is still in the early stages right now.
Okay, I think I'm tracking that. So it's not necessarily that the height amendments in these R districts would be on the books as an alternate path to whatever ultimately gets adopted under the framework of MRS. It's that their overlay has a technical valence to it, so I don't want to use that word, but they would sort of interact, is your point.
Yes, I mean, to be more transparent with you, we are envisioning the multifamily reinvestment study to enable some optional increased development standards that beyond the 35, 45, or 60 feet of by right height, for example, that would be enabled in these multifamily districts to allow some sort of increased increment of development, but to acknowledge some of those other communities' needs that I described, and some of the things that you're hearing about on the call today pertaining to trees and open space and surrounding neighborhood context as well.
Indeed. Okay, thank you. I mean, this is just tremendously complex, and I think
yes,
that breeds an opportunity for concern, right? We fill in the blanks for the things we don't yet know with the worst case scenarios when we anticipate it. Part of what undergirds my asking about this is you were just answering in response to one of Mr. Karantonis's questions that we would maybe see, and I think I heard you right, like 1 or 2 sites come in a year, with this sort of type of under this type of analysis or amendment. And I do wonder, knowing how ongoing the multifamily reinvestment study has been and how much finer grain, right, and kind of more specific work has been underway. And given that we're not anticipating a flood of, 100% CAF projects, that if they don't go on the next year, we'll lose the opportunity forever.
That's right.
I can't help but wonder if the best way to address some of the concerns that are unique across the county would be to see if we couldn't narrow the scope of this amendment a little more to maybe the couple of projects in the pipeline that we think are most likely to come in and take advantage between now and first quarter 2022. I don't know what that would look like. Here, obviously, we want to steer well clear of anything like spot zoning. But it is sort of interesting to me. It sort of makes me think like, all happy edge zoning areas are alike. All unhappy edge zoning areas are unhappy in their own way, right? We've got Blandley highly concerned for one reason, and stakeholders of the form-based code regime on the Pike upset for another, and neighbors in Green Valley upset for a third. And if the multifamily reinvestment study might give an opportunity to sort of consider those concerns in a more fine-grained basis than this amendment would, is there just a way to kind of shrink the scope? I don't know the answer to that. I'm sort of putting it on the table as you all think about preparing the final amendments for us to come forward for our consideration. But I do wonder if that couldn't quell some of the concern, or at least move forward some of that concern to an environment, i.e. the MRS, when there's going to be more of an opportunity to address it with specifics.
Yeah, no, this is helpful feedback. Again, thanks so much, Ms. Crystal, and believe us in that the need to be precise and narrow with the scope of this study is something that we spent a lot of time internally thinking on, and quite frankly, we feel that we have a fairly elegant solution with the 2 findings, but we know that we are not the only ones in the room. We've heard feedback from yourselves and others in the community. Let us work amongst ourselves over the course of the next month. We'll share some additional thinking and thoughts on the prospects of narrowing further. I would contend that a lot of the analysis and sort of the critical thinking that you've provided in your feedback to us already illustrates the challenges in that, where can you narrow by certain a distance from a metro rail station, or a certain functional class of a road, or these different kind of geographic mechanisms or scale mechanisms, and then as soon as we winnow, we have that one project that comes in, and the board, we're all telling ourselves, well, we've winnowed too far. So
right,
yeah.
And indeed, that was the genesis of even doing this sort of short-term correction, right? Because when we lifted the density caps, this was it's all unintended consequences. And I think the last thing that I'll just say is to clarify, because I do think that you have scoped the findings narrowly enough to really winnow down, as you said, the number of sites to which this would apply. What I was thinking in terms of narrowing the scope was more in terms of narrowing the geography, because I think one of the things that has become abundantly clear to me from community feedback on this and other issues is that folks are really concerned about what changes in zoning policy will do to landowner incentives. And I know you talk about this in the board report, right? Like we really don't see, just sort of a singular building height modification provision as like the inducing factor for a nonprofit affordable housing developer to go acquire a property that they otherwise might not. We don't see it as the major inducing factor or tipping point for a current landholder or current landlord of a group of marks to behave differently. But I know that is very much what's worrying folks in the community. I think it's a little bit less of a concern that their feedback wouldn't be heard, I hope, or maybe they also don't trust the board, but I think it's less of a concern that their feedback wouldn't be heard by the time it got to board and staff in terms of that finding too about sensitivity towards the neighborhood. I think there's this worry that this is going to spur private actors in the market to act in such a way that marks or lower density housing that's valued by the neighborhood somehow gets disappeared or threatened before there's even a community process to participate in. So I'm not sure of the answer to that. I know you all have thought about this question before. It may be a communication challenge or an opportunity to bring some market analysts into our discussion and educate ourselves collectively as much as anything else. But I say all of that, and I swear this is my last point. I say all of that just to say, when I say narrow, I am thinking a little more about the geographies, not how do we get to that back end process and narrow what the findings might be, because I do think those are sufficiently elegant, as you said, and slim in their scope.
Ms. Crystal, thanks so much. I think the best response is for us to take your feedback and do some study, of course, working in consultation with the Housing Division as well as the Manager's Office, and to share some of that thinking with you next month.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers, for that, and Ms. Crystal for just getting a thorough sense of the issues that will be before us if we choose to do this advertisement. I think we should move now to, if there is a motion on this issue, I'll want to just say some concluding comments. Others may, but go ahead if there's a motion.
I can make a motion, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Karantonis. So
I move to adopt the attached resolution to the staff report that's in my copy, page 13. To authorize advertisement of public hearings by the Planning Commission on April 5th, 2021, and by the County Board on April 17, 2021, to consider proposed amendments to Articles 12 and 15 of the Arlington County Zoning Ordinance to allow modifications of the maximum building height of up to 60 feet for multifamily residential development in the zoning districts RA 14 to 26, RA 8 to 18, and RA 6 to 15 by the County Board through its site plan approval authority for development projects providing 100% of the dwelling units as low or moderate income housing, and to make other editorial changes to improve clarity.
Second. Do you want to speak to your motion, Mr. Karantonis?
Just briefly, we had already quite a robust conversation, and I'm looking, like everybody else, forward to even more and either deeper and more structured. I think that the density is a tool with which we achieve our goals. In this case, our housing goals. Mr. Rogers already referred to the compendia that measure the loss of market rate of affordable units. Under Mr. Dorsey's leadership, in 2019, our Metropolitan Council of Government committed, all together, we committed to 320,000, production of 320,000 units in this decade we are right now. So there is absolutely no time to discard. So we cannot. We have to take the affordable housing development opportunities when they arise, while we are studying with diligence to organize our zoning policies even better. I think it checks the proposed measure. It checks all the goals that we wanted to check. Affordability, it's committed to affordability 100%, and we can discuss further how deep that may go. It is appropriate, and it takes appropriateness of the development very seriously. We heard a lot about neighborhood manners like tapering and urban design and development standards. And I believe that, it is very clear that we have the sense of it's an interim, but it has to be compatible, not alternative to, but compatible, and flow into our MRS study work that will be completed next year. But in the interim, we see that hopefully a couple of projects will come along, and there will be very good projects on which we still have a lot of discretionary power to steer in the right direction so that they're compatible with the neighborhoods and with the community goals.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will support Mr. Karantonis' motion, and I do associate my remarks largely with his. I get people's concerns. Density always arouses, as Ms. Crystal noted, people conceiving of the worst case scenario and responding to that. But by no means is the worst case scenario, I think, what we are likely to realize here. And I think this is well enough structured for us to begin the public process of conversations, reminding ourselves that no decisions are being made here. As Mr. Karantonis noted, building heights are a tool not only for that density, but to also achieve other benefits, which have not really been too much a part of our conversation. The transitions to existing neighborhoods that he mentioned, also the ability to provide for a greater degree of open space that may exist already, and of course, increasing that very needed supply of affordable homes in our community. And so I recognize that as people look at this, they wonder about unforeseen and unintended consequences. And when it comes to incentives that would maybe have us lose existing supplies of marks or other valued assets, not only do I think that that's likely not going to occur based on the frequency of development activity, but really just looking at existing land use opportunities and how they reflect market activity. You know, it took decades for the RB corridor to be built up, despite a tremendous incentive over the status quo from the time, Metro was completed. You look at areas along Columbia Pike where there's a tremendous incentive to redevelop, particularly commercial spaces to include residential spaces. Those incentives are profound and deep. However, if you already have an existing asset that is, bringing in income, there is not going to be that automatic turn of the switch to do something more intense. So I think, we can socialize that over the next month. We can discuss that to maybe, take down the temperature of what Ms. Crystal noted is our natural desire often to think of the worst case and assume that that's going to be reality.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank Mr. Rogers too for the presentation. Actually, the history going back and kind of how we got here. That I think that's very helpful. And I'm pleased to move forward. I appreciate Ms. Crystal's comments. I often fall back on though when you try to, people want us to nail down every little thing, and you really just can't. And the fallback to some extent is the board having the final discretion and final decision. We are, we represent the people in the county, and we get elected for doing that. And I think that's democracy at work and a good fail-safe, and sometimes the best, most flexible way to sort of handle it, I think. So I'm pretty comfortable with where we are. I look forward to more discussion next month on this. And as I say, I think this is just part of our overall development and housing discussion. I think at some point too, it would be helpful. I noticed like the item we just had, and even this one, you're showing some pictures of the buildings, and in many ways they've gotten older. They're not really very attractive, and what they get replaced with often is better, I think. If we do it right, it is better, and that's how we move forward and get better. So that's what we're trying to do and accomplish a lot of goals. So onward and upward, local government at its best. And thanks much.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. For my part, I think you colleagues, you covered well the policy discussions sort of broadly. I will say that listened very much to Mr. Sims' comments and Ms. Bodine, and Mr. Sims referred to the 2019 debate, which was related but not quite the same, wherein I actually felt that it was important to keep this discretion and worked hard to try to fashion an amendment that would seek to balance some of these concerns. We're at a different moment now, but I still do think that some of that logic applies to my initial thinking and interest in pursuing this. I would say for those who don't believe that we would consider this thoroughly, the last hour probably is some evidence that we do. And that doesn't mean that we have considered everything. But to Ms. Bodine's concerns, I understand that you've articulated quite a few. For me, the fiscal impact, I do think that our overall, the county is in many ways continuing to be perhaps in at least as good fiscal shape as 20 years ago. And there's more to do to think narrowly about this issue. But the 2019 letter is a key piece to it. And we will seek to, I reserve all, as we all do, the ability to reconsider and think things through next month, and then at individual site plans as we seek to balance and remain true to the thought that how we evolve really matters. It's not that we're going to stay exactly the same, but how we evolve matters. So with that, I'll ask for a vote. I'll start with Mr. Karantonis. The question is on your motion.
I vote aye.
Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Dorsey.
Aye.
Ms. Crystal.
Aye.
And Mr. DeFerranti votes aye as well. The motion passes 5-0. Madam Clerk, is there anything else to come before the board today?